Hi, I'm Tim Janisewski, and welcome to Spotlight Matthew, our devotional study of the first gospel. Again, great to have you participating, and hopefully this is helping you to dive deeply and grow more broadly in your faith in Jesus Christ. We are currently looking at the last few days of Jesus' life, and it is Maundy Thursday, the night that Jesus is handed over to suffering and death. And as we saw in our last devotional study, Jesus is undergoing the mockery of a kangaroo trial inside the home of Caiaphas, the high priest. Well, interestingly, at the same time, there's a secondary thread to this part of the story that concerns Simon Peter. Now, recall that in the upper room, just a few hours earlier, Jesus has said that all of them will fall away, all of them will deny Jesus. And Peter, with his usual bravado, his usual sense of self-importance and self-confidence, says, "Oh, Jesus, no. Even if the other 10 who are here right now forsake you, I will never forsake you. And Jesus, even if I have to die with you, I will do so." Well, they indeed, right after that, are in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus asks Peter and James and John to watch and pray for an hour. They all fall asleep. So much for the constancy of Peter at this point. And right after that, of course, who shows up? Judas shows up with the temple guard and arrests Jesus, and along with the other 10 disciples, Peter flees into the night. But that's not the end of the story with Peter. It picks up very quickly because apparently Peter circles around to follow those who have arrested Jesus as they take him to the house of Caiaphas, the high priest. And in that day and age, usually a very wealthy house, a large house such as the one Caiaphas would have had, man of great importance, would have a very large courtyard within it. And Peter is able to make his way into the courtyard, watching to see what is going to happen with Jesus. And as Peter is on the outside, if you will, what we pick up is the trial of Peter on the outside in the court of Caiaphas, while Jesus is being subjected to that kangaroo court on the inside of the house of the high priest. So let's pick up the story here as we see Peter in chapter 26, beginning with verse 69. Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, that's Caiaphas's courtyard at his house, and a servant girl came up to him and said, "Oh, you also were with Jesus the Galilean?" But Peter denied it before them all, saying, "I don't know what you mean." And he went out to the entrance. And another servant girl, saw him, and she said to the bystanders, "Oh, that man was with Jesus of Nazareth." And again Peter denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Oh, certainly you too are one of them, for your accent betrays you." Then he began to invoke a curse upon himself and to swear, "I do not know the man." And immediately the rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the saying of Jesus, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." And Peter went out and wept bitterly. Here we have the record, as I said, of Peter being unofficially tried outside in the courtyard of Caiaphas's house, while Jesus is officially being tried on the interior. And all of the vibrato, I keep getting that wrong, bravado of Peter comes crashing down around him. He comes from a man who boasts of his faithfulness and his constancy to someone who will be broken, because he is tried through 3 questions. First of all, "You're one of them." And he says, "No, I'm not." And the second one, "Oh, yes, you are. You are one of them." And he swears with an oath that he is not one of those who follows Jesus. And then the third time, heightening it even more, he brings down an actual curse upon himself when he denies any relationship to Jesus whatsoever. And upon bringing down that curse on his own head, the rooster crows. And in that moment, Peter is convicted of the sin that he has committed, of how he has failed, how he has fallen away, how he has forsaken Jesus and betrayed Jesus, even as Jesus predicted that he would, despite all his boasts, that he would never fall away, that he would even die with Christ. So here we see boastful Peter becoming broken Peter as he stumbles outside into the darkness and weeps bitterly. And here's an interesting thing. Matthew does not again mention Peter in the first gospel. That is the last reference to Simon Peter. Matthew leaves Peter stumbling out into the darkness. Matthew leaves Peter weeping bitterly, knowing that he has forsaken Jesus. And interestingly, though it's not in Matthew's record, if we look to Luke, Luke records in Luke chapter 22, verse 61, that when the rooster crows, Jesus, perhaps through a window, perhaps through a doorway, looks out and sees Peter, and Peter sees Jesus. And at that moment, Peter knows not only that he has fallen short and denied Jesus, he knows that Jesus knows it as well. Well, we know that elsewhere within the New Testament that Peter is forgiven, Peter is restored. He will become foremost among the leaders in the early church, and throughout church history will be extolled very highly by some traditions, in my view, much more highly than he ought to be extolled and more highly than he himself would extol himself, but that's another story. The point is that Peter makes a comeback of colossal proportions after this scene. But he doesn't in Matthew. He doesn't in Matthew. He is left to his sin. He is left to the darkness of his failure to Jesus and to God. In Matthew, Peter goes from cocksure to hearing the cock or the rooster crow, knowing that he has failed his friend and his rabbi and his Lord. I'd like to apply this to our own lives. Yes, is it possible to get stuck in our sin and in our recognition of conviction of sin, that we get into a dark place from which we never emerge? That can happen. We see our sin and confess our sin, but are unable to receive the forgiveness of Jesus, the assurance of pardon, and the restoration that we all need in our lives. It is possible for that to happen, to be sure. However, and it is a big however, I would say that that is not the case in most of American evangelical Christianity. Our tendency is not to look at our sin, to dwell on our sin, to be gripped by the way that we fall short of being faithful to Jesus. We fail to think deeply about where we deny him, we forsake him, we abandon him, we disobey him. We're too busy rushing on to being forgiven and restored and renewed and anticipating and looking for the blessings and forgiveness, the mercy, the kindness, the grace that comes to us through Christ, all of which is true, all of which is legitimate. But we shouldn't, I don't think, rush on from our confession of sin and our sense of how we are just like Peter. And we need to leave ourselves sometimes just where Matthew leaves Peter in the first gospel. You know, I have seen that rarely in worship is there a time for dedicated confession of sin in so many of our evangelical churches, whereas that used to be just common stock. It was part of just about every worship service everywhere 50, 75, 100 years ago. In fact, I can recall I attended a very fine evangelical church that was very well aware of sinfulness and the need for forgiveness. But in a 6-month period, not once in those worship services at that fine church did we stop to confess our sin, to observe a time of silence and look at the darkness of our own failings and ask for Jesus to forgive us and have mercy upon us. Not once, not once. Ask yourself in your own church, do you stop and confess your sin? Do you feel the gravity of that which you are forgiven on a regular basis? I really think that we in the American church have difficulty with this. You know, we're kind of like that scene out of Pride and Prejudice, if you know that great story by Jane Austen, one in which Mr. Bennet, the father of the household, has allowed one of the daughters to go in a place where she has run off out of wedlock with a man, bringing down disgrace upon himself, his wife, and all of his other daughters. And his daughter Lizzie says, "Oh, Papa, you should not feel it too deeply. You could not have seen and anticipated what she would do." And the father stops and says, "No, Lizzie, let me feel this deeply. For once in my life, I need to feel this deeply." But do not worry. The feeling will pass, and no doubt, too quickly. Well, I think that's what we tend to do in American evangelical Christianity. We may feel it for a moment, but it passes, and no doubt, too quickly. Well, Matthew wouldn't have it pass too quickly, and maybe we need to take time in our own devotional life as well as our church life to feel it deeply as Peter did that night as he stumbled out into the darkness and wept bitterly. That's a hard word to be sure, but I think it's a gospel word. Thanks for listening. Like us on Facebook. Check us out at spotlightgoodnews.com, and we'll talk to you next time.